aboard Pink Monorail. I'm your pilot, Michelle Valladolid, and next to me is my co-pilot, Noe Valladolid.
Hey, everybody.
In 1904, Meet Me in St. Louis was what everybody was singing. Celebration of the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, and the posters were done by Alphonse Mucha. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition was the proper name of it, and it ran from April 30th all the way to December 1st. It cost $15 million, which was equal to $489 million today. There were 60 countries, 40 of 45 U.S. states and territories, 19.9 million people. 1803 was the Louisiana Purchase.
So they delayed it a year because of constructions and delays for the centennial.
Yes, again, it happens. The annual St. Louis Exposition, which was a local exposition, was not held that year. This was held instead. Today the fairgrounds are Forest Park and Washington University. It was 1,200 acres, the largest fair in the area to date. 1,500 buildings, 75 miles of walkways, industries, cities, private organizations, theater troupes, and music schools took up most of the buildings. There were over 50 concession-type amusements in the Pike, which was their midway. See, Long Beach Pike, I put a note to myself. We had a amusement park here called the Pike.
Yes, we did.
Now it's a shopping center, and it's really, really depressing. They had educational and scientific displays, and by scientific displays we mean human zoos, exhibits, imaginary travel to distant lands, history, local stuff, palaces again, the Palace of Agriculture, horticulture, and transportation were among them. Wireless telephone or radiophone was presented by Alexander Graham Bell.
Oh.
And we all know how fabulously
Well, I think his mom,
popular.
His mom was more famous than he was at the end.
Really?
Yeah, Ma Bell. Everybody was calling Ma Bell.
That's right.
Sorry. I'm Generation X, but even I know that's an old joke.
That's terrible. I love it. It developed into radio and telephones. The Finson light was used to treat tuberculosis. They had infant incubators, and they had 24 neonatal babies and 10 nurses on display.
Wow.
This became really popular in America around that time, until about the 1930s or 1940s, was you'd give birth to a premature infant, and you couldn't care for it. It would die at home.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd put it in one of these incubator shows that the doctors would put on, and they'd charge a nickel for people to come in and look at the babies.
Look at the preemies.
Yep, and they'd have graduations when the baby was healthy enough to get home.
Oh, wow.
They saved a lot of babies.
Yeah.
It was really awful.
Showing them off like some sort of freak show?
Yeah, exactly, but it saved a lot of babies. You can't argue with that. They had an electric streetcar. They had personal automobiles. They had 140 models of automobiles and transportation items. They had gas, steam, and electricity for cars. They had a prototype car radio. They had an airship contest. No one won. They had a wireless telegraph tower. Eads Bridge. The Palace of Fine Art is now the St. Louis Art Museum. The administration building is now Brookings Hall on University of Washington. Creation moved from the Pike to Coney Island, Dreamland. St. Louis Zoo birdcage dates to the fair. The birdcage, the aviary in the St. Louis Zoo, dates back to the fair. They had a Jain temple carved out of wood, which is now the Jain Center of Southern California. They had a cast iron Vulcan statue, which is now in Birmingham, Alabama. They had a World's Fair pavilion in Foggett Park. The largest organ in the world tripled in size and became Philadelphia's Wanamaker organ.
Wanamaker, or not a Wurlitzer,
No,
Wanamaker.
Wanamaker, for the guy who bought it. That's now, Wanamaker's is now a Macy's, and it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
A replica of the Missouri building is now at College of the Ozarks. The observation tower is now at Cher Coeur Lake. The Swedish pavilion is now in Lindsborg, Kansas. We have the St. Louis Exposition to thank for the ice cream cone, iced tea, and cotton candy also became popular, as did hamburgers and hot dogs.
Hooray!
Dr. Pepper and puffed wheat, and the first food court. Now, I think the first food court was back when they had those first fairs.
Right.
But that's just me.
This is the American food courts?
Yeah. The Filipino exhibits are now at the University of Iowa. The Smithsonian Institution now has the blue whale that was exhibited at the exposition. Say that 3 times fast. The fair hosted the 1904 Olympic Games. It was originally supposed to be in Chicago, but St. Louis threw a fit and said, we're going to have a sports competition of our own, and more people will come to it.
Yeah.
So,
they had cotton candy and Dr. Pepper. Who wouldn't want to come there?
That's right. So they went ahead and moved the Olympics, much to the chagrin of Chicago. But that's okay, because Chicago still threw the best fair.
Yeah, they did.
Many European countries didn't come because of the Russo-Japanese War. Also, the fair was closed on Sundays. I remember the ladies' auxiliary had asked that they close the World's Columbian Exposition on Sundays, and they were like, no. It's the only day working people can come.
Right, they're not going to give that up.
The Anglo-Boer War was in a 15-acre arena. They had Zulu, San, Suraway, and Ndebele villages. The British Army had an encampment. Every 2 to 3 hours they had reenacted battles. The Boer General Christian de Bet was on a horseback and jumped 35 feet down into water. It was 25 cents for the cheap seats and $1 for the box seats. It netted over $3 million in today's money. Theodore Roosevelt, Geronimo, John Philip Sousa, Thomas Edison, that man loved expositions.
He did.
Helen Keller gave us a lecture. J.T. Stinson was the one who came up with an apple a day keeps the doctor away. That happened here. Grover Cleveland came to visit and did not get shot. T.S. Eliot was there. Jack Daniel got a gold medal for his booze, his whiskey. And the Sundance Kid made an appearance.
Robert Redford?
There was a special musical performance for the exposition. My co-pilot plays cello on it. Have a listen.
So a little bit of trivia for you. The Louisiana March was written specifically for this expo. A lot of music from the turn of the century has sort of been sitting in the Smithsonian and in colleges, private libraries, and this was recently rediscovered like less than a decade ago. And there was a college that played it before we did. We cleaned it up and we performed it. So Long Beach Community Orchestra is like the second orchestra in 100 years to have played it. So it was an honor to be on that in that performance.
And it sounded great. So we're going to leave Louisiana on that musical note, and we're going to go to Liege for 1905. That Liege is in Belgium. It was commemorative of the 40 years of Leopold's reign. He was not the one who owned a country.
Right.
29 countries showed up. There was a Palace of Fine Arts, which is now La Boiserie. In 1906, Milan threw its hat into the ring. The Milan International was 4 million visits, 250 acres. It opened April 28th and closed October 31st. It celebrated the opening of the Simplon Tunnel. Now, Simplon sounds like a weird word, but if you are a fan of British railways, you know that there is the Venice Simplon Orient Express train that goes through Europe. This was another Simplon route, and it had a tunnel through the Alps from Italy to Switzerland.
Oh, wow. That's an engineering feat.
That is an engineering feat, and they did it without computers. There was 2 single tracks tunnels, and it was the longest tunnel in the world until 1982, when a longer one opened up in Japan. The fair was held in Sempione Park and Piazza de Arneo, yet another military stomping ground.
Well, the military usually has a lot of space where they can train their soldiers and have their tanks and whatever do their formations. So that's plenty of space where they can build these expositions.
And they had fine arts, industrial, and engineering presentations called the Milan Exposition Elevated Railway. There was an International Commission on Occupational Health that is still active. The Milan Aquarium is still standing. I wonder if our pal Andrea takes his son Albie there to see the fish.
Well, hopefully he does.
Because they're in Albie. They're in Milan. It's called the Aquarium Brunetti, and this was called the Great Expo of Work because it focused more on the working man than on the elites. The theme was nautical and overland transportation. In 1908, London had the Franco-British Exposition, which was not an official BIE exposition because it was literally Britain and France made up after centuries of war.
Good on them.
And they're still friends that we know of. It ran from the 14th of May to the 31st of October, and it was at first in the series of White City Expositions. No, I'm not kidding. They called the area the White City, and it's still called that. The buildings looked a lot like the Grand Floridian Hotel or the Hotel del Coronado, but none of the round ones, just the square ones. And little by little, those buildings got eaten away by progress, including the BBC. So now the BBC is there and a bunch of housing developments, but it's still called the White City.
Okay.
They had colonial villages, human zoos, an Irish village, a Senegalese village, all sorts of the success of imperialism, they called it. 150 Irish colleens who greeted you and showed off domestic industry, manufacturing, and art, and I'm sure brought you beer. The Senegalese said they were reported as being cleaner than they looked. I'm sure the Irish, too.
Well, this is what happens when they're celebrating imperialism.
The White City was used for 4 more expositions before it was demolished. The next one we're going to look at is 1910 in Brussels. We're going back to Brussels. They had 13 million visitors this time, 5 million more than last time. They lost 100,000 Belgian francs on the fair. The colonial section was now called the Royal Museum for Central Africa, the same sites as 1897, but also Mont des Arts in central Brussels. It had 26 countries. They had the Senegalese village and human zoo again. They had fine arts, Monet, Rodin, Renoir, and Henri Matisse. They had the altarpiece of St. John Benjamin's Church, a Type 10 Belgian locomotive for your foamers, hi Ken, and American Wild West show. In 1913, Belgium was the host again, but this time it was Ghent, G-H-E-N-T, Gent. It was the heyday of the Belle Epoque, April 26th to November 3rd. The Ghent-St. Peter's railway station was built there in 1912, and that was the Eiffel Tower of the fair. They had a new hotel called the Plandria Palace. The Citadel, again the army stomping grounds, park was the home of the fair. Old Flanders and other Belgian towns were above it. They had a Koren market, which is a wheat market, and it was famous for having visages carved around its faces, showing the heads of state who visited, and also Florence Nightingale. It ended on the eve of war and serious debts. Belgium's first aerial postage service was a highlight. They had the last human zoo, which makes me happy. Natives of the Philippines' 53 Igorot tribes people. They had a fellow named Trinechig who died of tuberculosis there, and they named a tunnel after him. There were 17 countries there. Next, we have 1915, San Francisco. This one's different. This was an official one. It's more fun to write about an expo when you've actually been to its location, here in Balboa Park, and I hope to see Chicago and New York someday. It was called the Panama-Pacific International Exposition. Because of California's temporal climes, it was held from February 20th to December 4th, 1915. It was officially celebrating the Panama Canal, but it also celebrated San Francisco's recovery from the Great Earthquake and Fire of 1906. There were 636 acres between the Presidio, home of the Walt Disney Family Museum, and Fort Mason, in an area now known as the Marina District. The C.P. Huntington was the first locomotive purchased by Southern Pacific Railway. The E.P. Ripley would follow later. They had a tradition of naming their locomotives after the heads of the company, and that followed when Disneyland opened. They had the E.P. Ripley and some others.
Right.
It's now at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. They had a telephone line to New York City, which was rare in those days.
From San Francisco to New York?
Direct to New York.
A long line there.
Yes, the Liberty Bell visited from Philadelphia. It was on a national tour. The 1915 American Grand Prize and Vanderbilt Cup auto races were held here, and the Smithsonian Institution had a pavilion. They had Native American culture of interest. The End of the Trail statue. It was destroyed during an earthquake in 1980, unfortunately, but it depicts Native American suffering.
During the Trail of Tears?
No, it shows him, it says the end of the trail. It shows a Native American looking out over the Pacific Ocean and in despair that there is no more land. There's now a copy at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum and Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. It showcased Native Americans as nobles rather than as savages. They had pageants, plays, like the Ramona pageant that they have. Native Americans were visitors, performers, and workers. They had a board of lady managers, like other fairs, and they were talking about the new woman.
Someday they might even be able to vote.
That's right, only 5 years later. The International Conference of Women Workers to promote permanent peace took place July 4th through 7th in the Peace Palace, 50 years before hippies got there. Now it's called the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium. They had a statue of the Pioneer Mother that is still in Golden Gate Park. They had 12 buildings: fine arts, education, social economy, liberal arts, manufactures, varied industries, machinery, transportation, agriculture, livestock, horticulture, and mines and metallurgy. The centerpiece was the Tower of Jewels, 435 feet tall, had cut glass, faceted jewels that were made of cut glass in different colors, and 50 spotlights would hit them and make them shine. They had a fountain of energy, court of the universe, a court of the four seasons, a court of abundance. The buildings were made of staff. They weren't as Beaux Arts. They were more Californian, but they weren't quite Mission. They were their own thing.
Sort of a blend of the two.
Yes. Palace of Fine Arts. If you're a fan of the Palace of Fine Arts, then you'll love the building where they have the Little Mermaid ride at DCA. It's the same building. It's
Modeled
a copy
after
of it. Yeah, exactly. It's a smaller version, and it was one of the buildings that was meant to break down. Tony Baxter told me this story first on a train. So it was meant to break down. They were meant to break down and fall apart. But people loved the building so much that they rebuilt it. It's been rebuilt from the ground up. It was temporary at first, meant to break down and look like ancient ruins, but so popular they built it up for standing today. Golden Dreams, now Voyage of the Little Mermaid, is the building that is built after it. In 1950, it was a crumbling ruin. In 1964, the original was completely demolished. Only the steel structure of the exhibit hall was left standing. In 1974, almost completely rebuilt except for murals and some pylons on the colonnade and ornamentation on the exhibit hall. In 1969, the Exploratorium Interactive Museum moved in. In 1970, the Palace of Fine Arts Theater opened, which was next to the Exploratorium. The Exploratorium took up 2 of the 3 spaces in there. Palace of Fine Arts turned in the third. It was built around a small artificial lagoon, and Wheel of Fortune taped in the theater in 1992 and 1996. Their Pike or Midway was called The Zone. California, Missouri, and Philippine buildings were also saved. The Japanese tea house traveled by barge to Belmont, California, where it became a private residence, and then a speakeasy, and then a restaurant. They had a 1/3 scale railroad, the Overfale Railroad to Scranton Ranch, but it was damaged in a fire in 2020. The Legion of Honor Museum in Lincoln Park is a full-scale replica of the French Pavilion. The Warehouse Tin Barn is now at Fort Hunter Liggett in South Monterey County. It's a fire department now. In 2015, they celebrated the century of the fair with a rededication of the Palace of Fine Arts. They also screened a movie, When the World Came to San Francisco. Meanwhile, in San Diego, they wanted to give a great big middle finger to San Francisco and hold their own exposition, which was not BIE approved, but they went ahead and did it anyway. They called it the Panama-California Exposition, and it was held from January 1st, 1915 to January 1st, 1917, 2 years long, at Balboa Park, also in 1935, also not BIE approved, also a middle finger to San Francisco.
So San Francisco had one at the same time.
Twice.
What's the beef?
I don't know, but, 1964 and 1965 in New York was not approved either, and look at everything they got done there. It was 640 acres. San Francisco had people urge President William Howard Taft, who was most famous for being fat, to deny support for San Diego in return for political support against the Republicans, who were the Progressive Party at the time. This changed over with the Civil Rights Movement under LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. No federal or state government funding, only 37,000 population in the city, so the BIE wouldn't even look at them. San Diego went ahead. Ulysses S. Grant Jr. and John J. Spreckles of the Spreckles Pavilion and Colonel D.C. Collier came in after Grant left, but those were the people running it. They sold subscriptions and got a bond measure passed for the buildings only. The Governor Hiram Johnson did fund the California State Building. The Olmsted brothers, son of Olmsted, who designed Central Park and the White City, the Olmsted brothers did initial design and then left. The design was Spanish Colonial Revival architecture, or Spanish Baroque. It had influences from Islamic and Persian architecture, a Moorish Revival, Mexican and Spanish Churrigueresque, which is a design style, a very, very detailed, overwrought, beautiful design. Spanish Baroque or Ultra Baroque was used until about 1750 in Spain. Extreme aggressive florid decorating, it was called. It's normally found near the main entrance of a building. California Churrigueresque was invented at this fair. An intentional contrast to neoclassical and Beaux Art styles, San Francisco was pretty much Beaux Art style with mission influences, arches mostly. Gorgeous buildings was the result, many still standing. This led to a mission architecture revival over a mostly Victorian city, and now San Diego is known for its mission architecture, not for its Victorian architecture.
But there's still a few Victorian places there, including that bed and breakfast we stayed at.
That's right, there were. Oh, I remember that place. That place was great. Winslow, one of the main designers, went on to design the Carthay Circle Theater, where Snow White premiered. It's a shop at Disney's Hollywood Studios and a restaurant at Disney's California Adventure. He also convinced Santa Barbara to adopt the colonial style as its official building style, and now Santa Barbara is known for being all very colonial. It was 25 cents to watch construction, which was about $7 today. There were 3 entrances, west, north, and east. The San Diego Electric Railway trolley cars and cars that were came into the west. Over the Cabrillo Bridge, they had century plants, a blooming type of American aloe. The figures over the gate symbolized the joining of west and east waters in the Panama Canal. They had an exhibition there called The Painted Desert, and it was 7 local tribes, including Apache, Navajo, and Tewa. It was not a human zoo. The native people ran it and represented themselves as neighbors, not exotic savages. They had about 300 people living there during the 2 years of the exposition. The rock structure was actually wire frames covered with cement, a technique later used in Hollywood and at theme parks, like Nature's Wonderland, Big Thunder. Concessions were found at the Isthmus, ISTHMUS, the Isthmus, and that would be their midway, including rides and games, a replica gem mine, an ostrich farm, like we said, very plentiful back in that day, until the 1920s when ostrich feather hats went out of vogue. There was a 250-foot replica of the Panama Canal. Cabrillo Bridge and the Fine Arts Building were intended to be permanent, and they were. Cabrillo Bridge is that really pretty tall one with the vines growing on it. The Botanical Building and Spreckles Orchid Pavilion also lasted. The Plaza de California, or California Quadrangle, was the center of the fair. There was an arcade enclosure like at Knott's when you go into Fiesta Village. And they have that, and they have the candy store and stuff. It's changed since they redid it, but I think you know what I mean.
Right.
California Mission Adobe style, crude and plain. But those were temporary buildings. Many of the buildings were reused for the 1935 fair. 4 were demolished and rebuilt. The House of Charm, House of Hospitality, Casa del Prado, and Casa del Balboa. It's on the National Register of Historic Places now, so you can't knock them down anymore. They had these chairs called electriquette chairs, which were little electric wheelchairs, but they were big fancy wicker seats, and you could ride them around very slowly.
Oh, wow.
When they had their anniversary, they brought back those chairs, and people rode around in them and couldn't believe how slow they were. It was faster to walk. The aviary, rose garden, and animal pens became the world-famous San Diego Zoo. They had 2 million plants, 1,200 types of peacocks, pheasants, and fowl, and freely wandered, as well as pigeons, whose relatives are there now. So if you go there and feed the pigeons, you're feeding the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the ones from the fair. There were no foreign countries and only 6 states at first. The Marines, Army, and Navy had on-site tent cities, exhibits, parades, band concerts, and mock battles. President Woodrow Wilson opened the fair by telegraph by pushing a button in D.C. to signal to turn on the power and lights. There was a balloon 1,500 feet above that shone arc lights down on the fair. People didn't get to ride in it. It was just to shine the arc lights down at the fair. Fort Rosecrans and Navy ships fired guns. It was 50 cents for adults and 25 cents for children. Visitors included Vice President Thomas R. Marshall, Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I think we're going to hear his name again. William Howard Taft, who was against the fair until he was for it, Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Ford, and of course Thomas Edison. The Liberty Bell made a 3-day appearance on her nationwide tour. Most directors changed in 1916. They only had a 1-year contract. So on March 18, 1916, the Secretary of Navy, Josephus Daniels, pushed a button in D.C. that sounded a gong in San Diego that said the Exposition Dedication Day. So it rechristened the Panama-California International Exposition. They had exhibits from closed San Francisco Fair, Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Russia, Switzerland. They were unable to return to Europe because of World War I, so why not?
So they just stayed there.
So they just moved down to San Diego. They added an alligator farm, an ice rink, some performances. Some buildings were repurposed. On January 1st, 1917, there was a military parade in the Plaza Panama. There was a mock military battle and opera performances at the Organ Pavilion. I almost said Spreckles Organ Pavilion. Didn't become the Spreckles Organ Pavilion till later, but Spreckles did work on the fair.
Okay.
At midnight, the lights went out and fireworks spelled out World Peace 1917 above the organ. Only 4 million people altogether came. It wasn't great, but there was a war going on, and it was not sanctioned by the BIE. In 1915, near the beginning of the fair, Theodore Roosevelt gave a speech and pleaded with them not to destroy the beautiful buildings. The animal exhibits became the world-famous San Diego Zoo, the greatest zoo in the world. The Botanical Building is the Botanical Building and Lily Pond, a botanical garden. Cabrillo Bridge is now coated with ivy and very beautiful. The California Bell Tower is there, 198 feet tall. The California State Building is now part of the Museum of Us, which used to be called the Museum of Man. The Chapel of St. Francis of Assisi is now St. Francis Chapel, operated by the Museum of Us. It used to be called the Museum of Man, as I said, and we would go there when I was a kid, and it was from Neanderthals and up until modern day. And they had a big exhibit of when California was Mexico. And they had an old woman there, and I remember her very well, and she would hand make tortillas.
Oh boy.
And hand them out, and you have them with butter.
Oh, those were the best.
When your mom made those, it brought me right back.
You never forget fresh-made flour tortillas with butter.
Fresh-made flour tortillas with butter. So I always got the flour tortillas at California Adventure, but they weren't as good.
Nah, they never are.
But their corn ones, they were out of flour, so I was like, all right, I'll take a corn one. And it was so sweet. It was really good. I love sweet things. Like I said, the Spreckles Organ Pavilion is now the Spreckles Organ Pavilion.
The Organ Pavilion is now the Spreckles Organ Pavilion.
Yes, the Spreckles Organ Pavilion. The Administration Building is now offices for the Museum of Us. The Commerce and Industries Building was the Canadian Building in 1916, and then the Palace of Better Housing in 1935. It was renamed the Electrical Building, lost in an arson fire in 1978, and reconstructed as the Casa de Balboa.
Very nice.
Very nice. The Foreign Arts Building, which is different from any other fair, was altered and renamed the House of Hospitality in 1935. Now, my sister, when I was very little, I was 5 or 6, my sister was 4 years older than me. And she and her class went down to Balboa Park, and they visited the House of Hospitality and a lot of little houses from different countries. And of course, that's left over from the fair. The house I was talking about, the House of Hospitality, was reconstructed to be permanent in 1997. A few of the buildings in 1996 and 1997 were redone in earthquake specifications and all
very
that.
good.
The Varied Industries and Food and Products Building, Foreign and Domestic Building, 1935. 1971 was reconstructed as the Casa del Prado, which I've been to. The New Mexico State Building became the Palace of Education in 1935 and is now used by Balboa Park Club. The Indian Arts Building became the Russia and Brazil Building in 1916. It was rebuilt exactly in 1996 as the House of Charm. The Southern California Counties Building burned down in 1933 and was replaced by the Natural History Museum. The Kansas State Building, the Theosophical Headquarters in 1916, the United Nations and Italy was modeled after the Mission San Luis Rey. That's the mission closest to where I lived in California. I lived in Fallbrook. It was in Oceanside, and we went there and did a tour, of course. When I was in 6th grade, I had to do a model of the mission. I don't know if all 6th graders have to do a mission model in the state now, but back then...
Well, back then, yeah. Including when I was a kid, I think I remember some of the extra credit projects was to do a report or a model or a drawing of some of the old missions.
Did you do anything?
I think I did a drawing, and I think my classmate did like a paragraph on a couple of the missions.
The Santa Fe Depot from the fair, the baggage building, is now used by the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego. I don't know if it's for exhibition or storage. Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised San Diego would become a Navy port. It really did. It certainly did. It's now a major Navy port. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle and Mabel Norman made the film Fatty and Mabel at the San Diego Exposition. The same year, they made a film called Fatty and Mabel at the San Francisco Exposition. They were covering all of their bases.
Absolutely.
In the early 1960s, a few buildings were destroyed and replaced with, and this is my own phrasing, god-awful eyesores. The people rebelled and in 1967 formed a Committee of 100, which had way more than 100 members, to protect and preserve the park buildings. The city council said all new buildings must match the style. So if you build a new building in Balboa Park, it has to be in that 1915 style. In the late 1990s, several buildings were rebuilt, as I said, and they had a major celebration for the centennial in 2015. And like I said, they brought back the electriquettes.
Those wicker electric wheelchairs that went super slow.
Right. Of all the world's fairs, this is the best preserved. Now, I was going to talk about the 1929 Barcelona International Exposition, because it was the next official BIE International Exposition. The war and aftermath of the war really took its toll in the United States and Europe, so there was a long break in between expositions. So we went from 1915 to 1929.
Yeah.
But let's step back a bit. I talked about smaller expositions and local expositions, and like St. Louis has an annual exposition. France does. So we had a small exposition in a place called Long Beach, California in 1928. That is where we live.
Yeah, not in 1928, but in Long Beach.
No. It was called the Pacific Southwest Exposition to commemorate the landing of Spanish missionaries in California. The buildings had a single architect, Hugh R. Davies. Tessa, the digital collection of the Los Angeles Public Library, has a photo of the crowds on opening day and of the buildings. It shows people waiting by a huge reflecting pool for a show to begin in the bandstand. HomesteadMuseum.blog has some great pictures of the fair. It opened July 27th and it lasted only until September 3rd, so it was 40 days. Local expositions were usually shorter than international ones. It was open from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. daily, and their midway was called the Fun Strip. I will bring up the world-famous Long Beach Pike in upcoming episodes, and I thought it was funny it was called the Fun Strip and not the Pike, but the Pike was actually someplace else. The maternal side of my family has lived in Long Beach since the 1900s, with one occasional stay in Philadelphia or Camden, New Jersey. So my grandma was a teenager during the exposition. She most likely attended. It was said to be a showcase of Pacific Rim countries, but Scandinavia, Yugoslavia, and Persia also took part. The buildings are modeled after those in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, distinctly North African in style. The Long Beach Press-Telegram newspaper, still operating today, ran a special edition for the exposition. In the future, we'll visit the Long Beach Historical Society and find out what we can. The fair took place on 63 acres of sand spit at the end of 7th Street and Long Beach Harbor. It was built in 5 months. There's a massive central plaza with a reflecting pool and a bandstand, center of the fair. Surrounding the plaza are palaces, education and fine arts, oil, which was a big business in Long Beach and still is, mining and manufacturing, and transportation and radio. Branches led off the periphery to participating nations. Fiji showed their crafts and arts and did not exploit their headhunting as did former expositions. They actually ran their own.
Very good. The Pacific Islanders finally get a chance to present their own culture and not be presented as some sort of sideshow attraction.
Exactly. They had the ancient treasures of mysterious China, though, if you want your
cultural
Orientalism.
insensitivity.
Yes. They had a small theater and a stadium and an athletic field. Buildings were made of staff, stucco, and plasterboard covered with cloth. It looked really authentic, according to the people who were there. The mayor and governor were there for opening day. Famous visitors include Clara Bow, Gloria Swanson, Cecil B. DeMille, Upton Sinclair, Charles Lindbergh, who had a statue there, candidate Herbert Hoover, and no Thomas Edison.
I guess he wasn't invited.
He may have showed up, but they didn't write it down. The fun strip had daily Islamic prayer sessions because they had a mosque there. They had a pageant in the big stadium called Friendship of Nations, which I'll get into in a minute. The California exhibits included joint agriculture between Pomona and San Gabriel valleys, and more than 20 nations, according to lbport.com, were there. The city had just been given deep water port status. It's now one of the largest ports in the USA, if not the largest.
And almost 11 to 14% of the goods entering the country travel on the 710 freeway, which is why it's always so slow.
That's good to know. The architect also did Community Hospital, the Meeker Building, and Poly High School. Were you born at Community Hospital?
No, I was born in... Well, I'm not going to say because that's the type of information that people can swipe to steal identities.
Oh, never mind. But built Poly High School. They had palm trees set up in boxes so that they didn't have to dig them up at the end of the expo, because it was only 2 months.
Oh, very nice.
Italy and Spain had really beautiful exhibits. The fun strip had outdoor acts, rodeo sideshows, an animal circus, and a Ferris wheel. It does not say how tall the Ferris wheel was. They had the Palace of Modes, which was dedicated to fashion, Bazaars of Tunis, which had food, cigarettes, and snake charmers. Cigarettes were a new thing.
Before people smoked cigars, and hand-rolled cigarettes were only for the cowboys.
That's right.
So these are the actual first produced cigarettes.
Cigarettes. Harmless cigarettes. Doctors recommend
them.
In the huge auditorium, they had a horse show with over 200 entrants. And they had something called the Disappearing Ballet. There was a big pool in the auditorium. And dancers and singers would perform, and then they'd jump in the pool and not come up.
Oh, so they had some sort of underwater grotto thing that they could hide in?
Yeah, some underwater secret exit.
So it's like watching one of those Ziegfeld Folly movies where everybody's doing the choreography and the big diving, and then they all just disappear.
Right, exactly. Over 250 singers and dancers. They had the Palace of Industry. They had a muezzin tower, which was the high point of the expo, literally. It looked over 2 large plazas. The Long Beach Municipal Band played concerts twice daily, and the Pacific Southwest March was written by band director Herbert L. Clark. We looked, and we can't find any recordings of it. As of yet. We're going to keep looking. Napoleon Bonaparte's coach was displayed in the France Pavilion. Herbert Hoover got to ride in it. The Chinese exhibit that I mentioned earlier had $500,000 in artifacts, including a $50,000 rug. A rug. $50,000 in 1928. Well, they sell for $100,000 now.
Absolutely.
So I guess I shouldn't be so surprised. More than 1 million people visited. It was 40 days. And after they left, Procter & Gamble opened a factory on the site, which operated until 1988. No expo buildings remain. Today, it's a Matson container and cargo yard. I picked up my dad's Volvo, later my Volvo, there when we shipped it from Hawaii in 2007. So I have been to yet another site of a World's Fair.
Very good.
Well, an exposition. This wasn't really a World's Fair.
Mm-hmm.
The Long Beach Historical Society has a picture of a fun strip sideshow called 2-in-1, quote-unquote, Oriental and Hawaiian dancers and musicians. Some of the things released for souvenirs were coins and postcards. You can find them on eBay, because I looked. The cost of the fair was $650,000. Not bad.
Mm-mm.
The California building was big. 22 countries, 8,000-seat theater. They had a ship cafe, which fed 24,000 people a day. That's 1 million visitors in 2 months, so that's really not bad. Anyway, this restaurant, the ship cafe that fed 24,000 people a day, was actually the front part of a large schooner docked on the ocean front. So you had your schooner docked there, and the front part of it was the restaurant.
Oh, wow.
They had a pueblo with Hopi and Navajo people, and they were sent as a delegation, actually. There were 55 buildings altogether. It's now called Pier C. Its nickname was the Dream City. Performing an opera there, this was very historic, was Daniel Simmons, also known as Chief Yaulache, a Native American opera singer, the first. Olive Hatch, a champion diver, performed at the disappearing pool. Okay, the Friendship of Nations show had lasso twirling, Ukrainian folk singing. You can find some of this on pbs.socal.org. The Bounding Baghdad, a fire dance by Mademoiselle Glorine, a Spanish dance by Senora Cordova, historical tableau of a Spanish conquistadors, Mexicans, Chinese laborers, Russian fur trappers, and old 49ers. Dancing Cacti, Renee Tominson's Dance of the Sun. The smaller theater had smaller acts and lectures. I don't know what any of the lectures were on, unfortunately. They had a federal agency displays, and it was called, by a women's magazine, the most precocious of flapper expositions. The Guatemala building was a modern Mayan pyramid by artist Rafael Yella Gunther. It was really beautiful. Look it up. It's really neat looking. It looks very modern, even though it's from the 20s. But they had very modern things, actually, in their style in post-art deco. Ecuador had a copy of their presidential palace at Quito. Belgian and Czechoslovakian had traditional designs. Bolivia had a mission church with a belfry. Persia was like a mosque. Japanese was in the style of the Nara era, not Nara Dream Park. We're going to get to Nara Dream Park. Even though this is a history of American theme parks, you can't talk about Disneyland without talking about Nara Dream Park.
Well, yeah, theme parks belongs to the world.
Yeah, you're right. The French building had the coach I talked about earlier that belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte. The California building had a pool stocked with trout that you could fish from. Mexico had contemporary paintings and sculpture. Francisco Camejo was best known for the Mayan theater in Hollywood. And they still have the Egyptian and the El Capitan, but all the other really great ones are gone. And the Mayan was one of those. Denmark had tapestries, embroidery, china, furniture and linens. Holland had bulbs and seeds from their famous tulips. They had wooden shoes, spices, tea, sugar, tobacco, and then we're back to Fiji, who showed their weaving and metalwork. The Palace of Industries was 10 acres. It included varied industries, pure foods and household equipment, land and community development, oil and mining, and manufacturers, machinery, and automotives. San Francisco decided that they were going to be part of the fun, and they brought down a scale model of the city made entirely of thousands of carved wooden blocks. They had a beauty contest for expo workers. They had days for the Fraternal Order of the Eagles, Fleet Day, Boy Scouts, and postal workers. The Spanish-American War veterans put on a parade. Norway sent a Viking ship from Los Angeles. The Fine Arts Dome collapsed September 3rd, 1 hour before closing, enduring 4. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sent the Hopi and Navajo people as emissaries from one country to another. Think about it. From one nation to another. The most popular and most photographed performers on the strip were the pirates.
Ooh.
And that is the end of the Long Beach Exposition. Barcelona in 1929 ran from 20th of May to 15th of January. The 6-month rule had not yet been set in stone. Now it's every 5 years, 6 months long, period. But back then the rules were still a little
flexible, so you can have a year-long or a 2-year-long expo.
No, that wasn't official.
Oh.
This was official. 20 European nations participated in the fair. It was almost 300 acres large. In addition, they had private entities and companies from US and Japan. Now, Spain used to be called Iberia. Do you know that?
Well, the Iberian Peninsula.
Right. So they had the Iberian American section, which had the USA, Brazil, Portugal, etc. in Sevilla. There was lots of urban development. That's what this fair was important. That's what was important about this fair. They had Neocentisme, based on Catalan, replaced Monterisme. This fair marked the arrival of the Spanish avant-garde movement. Salvador Dali was greatly influenced by the fair. The Barcelona pavilion was done in the German Bauhaus style. Several permanent architectural buildings of note: the Palace National de Catalunya, the Font Magica de Montmajic, which is Montjus, which is the magical fountain, the Greek Theatre, Poble Español, and Estadi Olympic Stadium. The fair was opened by King Alfonso XIII on May 19th. It lost money due to the Depression.
I'm surprised you didn't ask me to try to say the names of any of those buildings.
You want to try?
Let's see if I can read your handwriting. So several permanent architectural buildings of note. There was now I'm going to try to say it in Spanish, so I'm going to have to say I'm going to have to lift. El Palace Nacional de Huatanga, el Font Magia Montajic, el Teatro Greek, el Poble Español de Estadio Olympique. So, for those that don't speak Spanish, that was the Palace National of Catalonia, the magical fountain of Montajic, is that right? Greek theater, and the Roble Español is the Noble Olympic Stadium. So that's because it was opened by King Alfonso, the 13th. Is that 19th? King Alfonso the 19th on May.
Oh, the 13th. Yes. King Alfonso the 13th on May 19th.
Okay.
Today, some of the expo buildings are used for the Barcelona Trade Fair. The magical fountain is still standing too. Art and tapestries by Goya were presented. Miles van der Rohe also had some art there. Swedish had neoplasticism, which is brand new. There's currently a project to rebuild the tower next to the Olympic Stadium. It lost money, but had a great positive impact on the city and country. They really became movers and shakers in the art world after this. Gas lighting was replaced with electric, public bathrooms were installed, paving and sewer systems were improved. Ongoing fairs, Feira de Barcelona, were established. Many old buildings were refurbished. The infrastructure was really strengthened. Communications were modernized. Trains moved underground. The airport was pretty much rebuilt. Roads were modernized. They brought in an electric trolley. I had a friend when I worked in the strip clubs. Julie, she was a stripper, and she was studying in college to become a consultant.
I believe they call them exotic dancers.
Oh, sure.
And I believe they call those consultant sharks now. Anyhow, continue.
This was the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, and she said she wanted to become a consultant in Spain because their infrastructure was from 1929 and was crumbling.
Oh, boy. Yeah, it hadn't been upgraded since this expo?
Right.
Oh, my gosh.
So, it's been upgraded now.
Thank goodness.
But the next thing coming up is the Chicago Century of Progress. How do you top the White City? You go in a completely different direction. But that's in the second group of World's Fairs. So we're going to stop here and come back to World's Fairs after we talk about trolley parks, Coney Island, amusement parks, and piers.
Very good. Shelly, if the listeners are interested in finding out more about your history and your writing, where can they find you?
They can find me at micechat.com, the happiest place in cyberspace, and at jimhillmedia.com.
If you're looking for articles on video games, which I write mostly on video games, fighting games specifically, you can do a search for me on the Street Writer podcast. So if you just Google or Bing it, you should come to my webpage. And if you're on YouTube, you can find some of my videos there as well. Again, just do a search for the Street Writer Podcast.
If you'd like to support this podcast, we're at patreon.com/fab, F-A-B, as in fabulous. And if you have any questions, you can reach us there.
A special shout out to our sponsor, circa 1955. Nicole is the founder of Luxillume.
a small company that makes candles, wax melts, and room sprays. She creates scents that capture the season, nature, or wonderful memories. She also takes commissions for larger orders, such as weddings or company gifts. It turns out that Nicole is also a huge Disney fan and has a line called Circa 1955. She creates scents inspired by all things Disney. This includes the parks, attractions, treats, and films. She creates each formula and batch of candles herself. For every one scent she's released, she's probably made over 200 trials just to get the smell right. Don't take my word for it. Go to circa1955.com, order a candle, and use promo code PINK15. That's PINK15 to get 15% off your purchase. Support a small company that also gives back to the community. You're going to love it. Another shout out to Jim Hill for hosting Pink Monorail on his podcast network. The Jim Hill Podcast Network also includes Looking at Lucasfilm, The Disney Dish, I Want That, and Fine Tuning. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review for each podcast. Have a great day.